The whistle of the train echoed across the Kansas plains like a mournful cry, scattering the crows that perched on the telegraph wires. Dust swirled around the depot platform as passengers stepped down, clutching their hats against the bitter wind. Among them was Clara Mayfield, her gloved hands wrapped tightly around a battered suitcase that carried all she owned. She drew in a shaky breath, her heart racing not just from the journey, but from the weight of hope she had carried across 1,000 miles. She had answered an advertisement, a promise of a husband, a home, and a chance at dignity far from the whispers of Boston parlors, where she was dismissed as too plump, too plain, and too much. Out here, in the wide West, where a woman's worth was measured in endurance and kindness, she believed she might finally be wanted. The crowd thinned until Clara spotted him. James Whittaker, her intended. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the swagger of a man who had never doubted his own importance. His hat was tilted back, his jaw freshly shaven, his boots polished. He carried himself like someone who knew the town was watching him. And indeed, several locals lingered nearby, their eyes curious, their whispers already stirring. Clara's heart leapt. She smoothed her traveling dress, tried to steady her trembling smile, and stepped forward. "Mr. Whittaker?" she asked softly, her voice nearly lost to the gust of wind. James turned, his eyes sweeping over her, from bonnet to boots. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, but instead of warmth, it hardened into disdain. His lips curled as though he'd bitten into something bitter. "You're Clara Mayfield?" he asked, his tone sharp. She nodded, clutching her suitcase closer. "Yes, I came as your letter asked. I'm ready to be a good wife." A laugh, cruel and unrestrained, broke from James. He gestured toward her, with a sweeping motion meant for the crowd. This is what I sent for. A woman twice the size I expected." Gasps and muffled chuckles rippled through the onlookers. Clara's cheeks burned crimson, her throat tightening until it hurt to breathe. James stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to sting more deeply. "I wanted a wife, not a burden. I won't be mocked for showing up with you on my arm. I'd rather stay alone than marry a woman who can't even look after herself." The words pierced sharper than any blade. Clara wanted to speak, to defend herself, but the humiliation clamped her tongue. She had survived years of snickers back east, but here, where she had hoped to start anew, the rejection cut deeper than ever. Her knees weakened, and for a moment she thought she might collapse onto the dusty planks of the station. But pride, some stubborn ember within her, kept her upright. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some shook their heads, others whispered. One woman covered her child's ears. And then, from behind James, a deeper voice broke through. "That's enough, boy." The voice belonged to Samuel Whittaker, James's father. He was a man well into his 50s, with hair touched silver and lines carved by years of labor and loss. His frame, though aged, still bore the strength of a man who had wrestled the land into yielding crops and cattle. Unlike his son, his eyes carried no arrogance, only a sternness honed by hardship. Samuel stepped forward, his gaze lingering on Clara. Where James had looked with mockery, Samuel looked with something gentler, something steady. "Have you no shame, humiliating a woman who came all this way with nothing but trust in your word?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of authority. James bristled. "Pa, this is none of your concern. I won't marry her. That's final." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Then you've proven yourself a coward. A man's worth isn't in how pretty a wife he can parade, but in how he honors his promises. You shame not her, James. You shame yourself." The younger man's face flushed. He turned on his heel and strode off, muttering curses as the crowd parted to let him pass. Clara stood frozen, trembling in the aftermath of her public disgrace. Her chest heaved with each breath, and tears pricked her eyes, though she fought to keep them from spilling. She whispered, almost to herself, "I should never have come." Samuel shifted his weight, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. He cleared his throat, his voice softening as he addressed her. "Miss Mayfield, I can't undo my son's cruelty, but I won't stand by and leave you abandoned in a town you don't know." Clara blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. My ranch isn't far, Samuel continued. You'll have food, a roof, and safety until you decide what to do next. You don't owe me anything. I simply won't see you treated like freight left behind. The kindness nearly undid her. After so much scorn, the offer felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Still, doubt gnawed at her. Could she trust him? Or would she only burden him further? I don't want to cause you trouble, she murmured. You're not the trouble here, Samuel said firmly, casting a glance in the direction James had gone. The trouble is a son who doesn't know what it means to be a man. Clara studied his face, the weathered lines, the steady eyes, and something inside her eased. This was not pity in his gaze. It was respect, quiet but unmistakable. The wind howled across the platform, rattling the signs and sending hats tumbling. Samuel extended a hand. Clara hesitated, then placed her gloved hand into his. His grip was strong, grounding, as if promising she would not be left adrift again. Together, they walked away from the gawking eyes of the town, Clara's suitcase bumping against her leg with each step. She did not know what awaited her at the Whitaker Ranch, nor how she would endure the shame James had cast upon her. But as Samuel guided her toward the waiting wagon, she sensed that her story was not ending in rejection. It was only beginning. The morning sun spilled across the rolling plains like molten gold, catching on the weathered fences and tilled fields of the Harper Ranch. John Harper stood on the porch, his broad shoulders slightly stooped, his gaze fixed on the horizon as though answers might rise with the day. A man carved by years of hardship, his face bore lines of resilience, but also of grief that lingered long after the world had moved on. His son had left him with responsibilities he had not asked for, debts, a fractured ranch, and now, unexpectedly, a young woman rejected in shame. Mary O'Connell sat in the kitchen behind him, her eyes lowered as she clutched a chipped porcelain cup. She had barely spoken since John had brought her home from that humiliating day at the church. Though he had offered her shelter, she could not quiet the gnawing ache of rejection. Every glance in the mirror reminded her of the cruel words whispered about her size, her supposed inadequacy as a bride. Yet here she was, under the roof of the very family who had spurned her. John turned back into the house, his boots thudding against the wooden floor. "You'll need to eat more than bread and tea if you are to get your strength back," he said quietly, his voice carrying both command and kindness. Mary looked up, startled by his tone. It was not pity she heard, but something firmer, like respect. Still, her pride fought with her gratitude. "I don't wish to be a burden, Mr. Harper," she murmured. "You've already done too much." A shadow flickered across his face. "You're no burden," he replied gruffly. "Life already gives us enough of those. You'll stay here as long as you need." But beneath his steady words, John wrestled with an unspoken conflict. The ranch had been slipping from his grasp for years, each season harder than the last. Taking in Mary meant one more mouth to feed, one more weight upon shoulders already bowed by labor and loss. Yet when he had seen her abandoned, tears streaking her face at the church steps, he had felt something stir, an echo of his late wife's compassion, a reminder of the vows he had once lived by, to care for those left vulnerable by life's cruelty. Days slipped into weeks, and Mary began to find her footing in the Harper household. She rose before dawn, helping in the kitchen, tending to the garden, even daring to assist with mending tack for the horses. Though she moved quietly, almost apologetically, her presence began to thread itself into the rhythms of the ranch. Still, whispers haunted her thoughts, every cruel remark about her body, every reminder that she was not enough for the man who had cast her aside. One afternoon, while gathering firewood near the barn, Mary stumbled across John repairing a broken fence post. His hands, scarred from years of work, moved with slow determination. She paused, watching him, her heart tugged by the sight of this solitary figure who bore so much on his own. For the first time, she dared to speak openly. "You carry more than one man ought to," she said softly, setting down her bundle of wood. John glanced up, surprised by her candor. "And you've carried more pain than one woman should," he countered gently. Their eyes met, his weathered by sorrow, hers clouded with doubt. In that brief exchange, Something fragile, yet undeniable passed between them. The recognition of two wounded souls bearing heavy burdens. From that day, their conversations grew longer. Mary spoke of her life before answering the newspaper ad that had promised a future as a bride. Her small hometown, her widowed mother, the loneliness that had driven her to seek love in strangers' words. John, in turn, spoke of his son's reckless ambition, the debts that had nearly ruined them, and the emptiness that had settled after his wife's passing. They were stories etched with pain, but also with resilience. And yet, even as closeness crept into their days, John remained guarded. He feared that giving his heart again would dishonor the memory of the woman he had loved and lost. Mary, too, feared that her growing feelings for John would be dismissed as foolishness, that her heart would be rejected once more, just as her body had been. The conflict between them was not spoken aloud, but it lingered like a restless wind. Each act of kindness carried unspoken questions. Each glance lingered longer than it should have. The ranch became not just a place of survival, but of silent yearning. One evening, after a long day of repairing fences, John found Mary in the garden. She was bent over the earth, her hands dirty, her face flushed from effort. Yet there was a glow about her, a determination that reminded him of his late wife's spirit. He watched her quietly before speaking. "You've changed this place," he said simply. Mary looked up, startled. "I've done nothing but try to repay your kindness." He shook his head. "It isn't just the chores. It's the way you carry yourself, despite what you've been through. The house feels less empty with you here." The words hung in the cool evening air, heavy with meaning. Mary's heart thudded, caught between hope and fear. Could it be possible that this man, older, burdened, yet steady, saw her as more than a guest under his roof? Before she could reply, John turned away, retreating into silence once more. His heart pounded with emotions he had long buried, but his fear held him back. He could not risk letting her know just yet. Mary remained in the garden, staring at the earth she had been tilling. A tear slipped down her cheek, not of sorrow, but of a fragile hope she dared not voice. She felt the weight of her past, but also the stirrings of something new, something tender and terrifying. That night, as the prairie wind rattled the windows, both lay awake in their separate rooms. John, wrestling with guilt and longing. Mary, clutching the pillow as though it might steady the storm in her chest. Neither could deny it any longer. Two hearts, each burdened with scars, were inching toward a bond neither had sought, but both desperately needed. And in that silent acknowledgement, the story of their future began to unfold, slowly, painfully, but with the promise of something far greater than either had dared to dream. The prairie wind carried voices, not the kind one could touch or answer, but whispers of neighbors, townsfolk, and kinfolk too ready to pass judgment on lives that were not their own. For Mary O'Connell, those whispers had always stung like nettles. She had lived with them since her youth. Too plump, too plain, too eager for love. And now, even in this new land with its endless skies and open fields, they followed her like shadows. When she walked beside John Harper to the mercantile, she could feel them pressing in from the edges of the boardwalk, the sidelong glances, the muttered remarks. "That's her," a woman hissed behind a gloved hand. "The bride who was left at the altar." Another voice, male and sharper, cut in. "No man with sense would keep her under his roof, not unless he pitied her." Mary kept her head bowed, clutching her basket tighter, her knuckles whitening around the handle. But John, tall and steady at her side, noticed everything. He caught the glances, the sneers half hidden beneath polite smiles. A flicker of anger tightened his jaw, but he did not confront them, not yet. His hand brushed against Mary's as though to say, "You're not alone." Inside the mercantile, Mary busied herself with bolts of fabric, pretending not to notice the whispers that followed even there. She focused on colors, textures, small things that gave her comfort. John, meanwhile, gathered supplies with methodical precision. He watched Mary carefully, noting how her shoulders hunched, how her smile never quite reached her eyes. He wanted to shield her, but he also knew that protection alone would not silence her doubts. She needed more than shelter. She needed belonging. Back at the ranch, the air felt lighter, freer from the scrutiny of town. Mary exhaled as though she had been holding her breath all day. She set about her chores with renewed determination, determined to prove to John, to herself, that she was not just some pitted woman under his roof. She baked bread that filled the kitchen with warmth, mended worn shirts with neat stitches, and tended to the hens as though they were fragile treasures. One evening, as they sat across from one another at the rough-hewn table, John spoke in that quiet, steady way of his. "You don't have to prove yourself here, Mary. This place doesn't run because of pity. It runs because people give what they can, and you've given more than most." Her eyes lifted to his, shining with both surprise and something softer. "But the town, they see me as nothing but a failure. They see me as too much." She broke off, her hand pressed against her bodice as though to silence her own heart. John leaned forward, his gaze unflinching. "Let them talk. They've never mended a fence or faced down a winter storm with nothing but grit and prayer. Their words won't feed cattle or fix broken walls, and their judgment sure as hell doesn't define you." Mary swallowed hard. His words struck deeper than any comfort she had known. For so long, her worth had been measured by other standards, by appearances, by cruel assessments whispered behind her back. Yet here was a man who saw beyond all of that, who valued her not for what she lacked, but for what she gave. Still, the whispers lingered in her mind, curling around her confidence like smoke. At night, in her small room down the hall, she lay awake wondering if her growing feelings for John were a fool's hope. He was kind, yes. He was steady. But could he ever truly see her as more than a wounded woman he had taken in out of duty? John, in his own solitude, wrestled with different doubts. He found himself listening for her laughter, watching her move about the house, feeling the emptiness lift in her presence. Yet guilt gnawed at him. Guilt for daring to imagine a future with another woman when his late wife's memory still lingered like a ghost in every corner of the home. Was it betrayal to let his heart stir again? Or was it the very thing his wife would have wanted, for him to live, not just endure? Their unspoken questions simmered until one brisk autumn afternoon, when John's sister, Clara, came to visit. Clara was sharp-eyed and forthright, unafraid of speaking her mind. The moment she saw Mary, she embraced her warmly, but her words later that evening cut through the quiet like a blade. "You know the town's talking, John," Clara said as they stood on the porch. "They think you're keeping her out of pity. Some even say it's improper. Your sons would be bride living under your roof." John's jaw tightened. Let them talk. She deserves better than what they gave her. Clara studied him, her expression softening. "I don't disagree. But you should ask yourself, brother, what is she to you? A burden? A guest? Or something more?" John said nothing, but his silence carried weight. Clara squeezed his arm and left the question hanging, heavy and unresolved. That night, Mary overheard fragments of their conversation as she passed by the open window. The words burden and improper seared into her, twisting her stomach with doubt. Had she been wrong to feel safe here? Had she mistaken kindness for something it could never become? The next morning, she moved quietly, her steps lighter, her presence almost ghostly. John noticed instantly. "Mary," he said, halting her as she carried a basket of laundry, "something's troubling you." She hesitated, then whispered, "I don't want to be the reason people dishonor your name. If my being here brings you shame." Her voice cracked, and she lowered her eyes. John's hand reached out, rough and warm, tilting her chin upward. His eyes met hers with steady conviction. "You're not ashamed, Mary. You're a blessing I didn't know I needed." The words tumbled out before he could stop them, raw and unpolished but true. Mary's breath caught, her heart hammering in her chest. For the first time since her rejection, she felt not just sheltered, but chosen, not because of pity, but because of worth. And in that fragile, charged moment, the burden of whispers began to fade. Yet, as dawn turned into dusk, both knew the road ahead would not be free of trials. The town's judgment still loomed, and the questions of their hearts had yet to be answered fully. But for now, in the sanctuary of the Harper Ranch, they had found something precious, the faint but unmistakable whispers of belonging. The first snow of winter fell in quiet flurries across Harper Ranch, dusting the fences and barns with a fragile whiteness. For Mary, the sight was both breathtaking and symbolic. Snow had a way of softening everything it touched, covering scars, quieting the harsh lines of the earth. Yet she knew that beneath the beauty, there were truths waiting, truths no storm could bury. Weeks had passed since John had called her a blessing, words that warmed her heart each time they echoed in her memory. Yet the whispers from town still trailed her steps like an unseen shadow. They called her unfit, too large, a burden dressed as a bride. And now, those whispers grew sharper, for it was no longer merely her reputation at stake. It was John's. One evening, John returned from town later than usual. His boots thudded against the porch, his coat wet with sleet. Mary, stirring stew at the stove, turned as he entered, reading the heaviness etched into his face. "What is it?" she asked quietly, though her heart already knew. "They've been talking louder," John admitted, lowering himself into a chair. "The pastor himself said it might be better if you didn't stay under my roof. Some folks are calling it sin. Others think I've lost my senses." His fists clenched on the table, knuckles pale. "I told them it was none of their damn business. But Mary, I won't let them tear you apart again." Her hand trembled slightly as she set down the ladle. She crossed the room and stood before him, her eyes luminous in the lamplight. "John, if my presence here harms your standing, perhaps I should." "No," his voice cut through the room, sharp and unwavering. He rose, towering over her, his gaze fierce yet tender. "You don't leave. Not because of them. You belong here, Mary. With me. With this ranch. With this family." Her breath caught, but her doubts lingered. Belonging was one thing. Being loved was another. And though his actions spoke louder than most men's vows, she had not yet heard the words her heart longed for. The following Sunday, John insisted they attend church together. Mary hesitated, dreading the eyes that would pierce her like arrows, but John would not go alone. So, dressed in her modest blue dress, she walked beside him down the aisle of wooden pews. The whispers began at once, hissing, sharp, cruel. Some women turned their heads deliberately, others smirked. Mary's cheeks burned, and she gripped the edge of her shawl until her fingers ached. But John did not falter. At the end of the service, when the congregation lingered in clusters, John cleared his throat, his voice deep and steady. "Since some of you seem to think my business is yours, I'll make it plain," he said, his eyes sweeping the room. "Mary is not a burden. She is not a mistake. She is the strongest woman I've known, and she has brought life back into my home. She was once rejected, but she is not unwanted, not by me, not by God." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mary's eyes widened, her breath caught in her chest. John continued, his voice gaining power. "I don't care for your judgment. I don't care for your wagging tongues. What I do care about is this woman standing beside me. I intend to make her my wife, not from pity, but from love." The church erupted, some in shock, some in scandalized whispers, and a few in stunned silence. But in that moment, the noise faded for Mary. Her world shrank to John's hand reaching for hers, his eyes unwavering, his words echoing like a promise carved into stone. Mary's knees threatened to give way, but her heart soared. Tears brimmed, not from shame but from the overwhelming relief of being claimed, not as a charity case, but as a partner, a woman loved beyond measure. That night, back at the ranch, Mary found herself unable to sleep. She stood by the window, watching the snowflakes gather on the sill, her heart full yet trembling with disbelief. John entered quietly, placing a blanket around her shoulders. "You shouldn't be cold," he murmured. She turned to him, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Do you mean it, John? All of it? You'd face them all for me?" He cupped her face gently, his calloused hands tender. "Mary, I've faced winters that nearly killed me. I've buried loved ones. I've fought storms that tore fences down to nothing. None of it compares to losing you. So yes, I'd face them all. 1,000 times over." Her tears spilled freely, but she did not look away. She pressed her forehead to his, her voice trembling. "Then let me love you as you've loved me. not in secret, not in shame, but in truth. Their kiss came softly, like the falling snow, quiet, unhurried, but certain. It was not the desperate spark of youthful passion, but the steady flame of two hearts finding refuge in one another. From that day forward, the whispers in town never fully ceased. There were still glances, still mutters behind gloved hands. But Mary discovered something profound. Whispers lost their power when love spoke louder. On the day of their wedding, the church was filled not only with critics, but also with those who had watched Mary's quiet strength, her steady kindness. Some came out of curiosity, others out of respect, but when she walked down the aisle, her hand in John's, she no longer bowed her head in shame. She met their gazes with dignity, her heart secure in the truth of his vow. And when John spoke his promise, "I take you, Mary, not out of duty, not out of pity, but because my heart has found its home in you," the last of her doubts melted like snow beneath the sun. Together, they built a life that was neither flawless nor free of hardship, but it was theirs. In the quiet evenings by the fire, in the laughter of neighbors who eventually learned respect, in the simple comfort of waking to a love that did not waver, Mary found what she had always longed for. Not just shelter, not just belonging, but a love beyond judgment. And in that love, she finally learned to silence the whispers, because the only voice that mattered was the one that chose her, again and again, with every sunrise,